There are days in history that look completely normal from the outside. The sun rises the same way it always has. Markets open, children run through the streets, fishermen pull in their nets, priests light the incense, bakers slide bread into ovens, merchants argue over prices in a dozen different languages. Nobody walking through the city that morning had any reason to believe that the world they had always known was about to split in two. Friday, April 3rd, in the year 33 of the Common Era, was one of those days. For most of the people living in Jerusalem that morning, it began exactly like any other Passover Friday. The streets were so packed with pilgrims that moving from one end of a block to the other required patience and physical determination. The smell was extraordinary, unleavened bread baking in every home, animals being led toward the temple, the sharp bite of incense drifting down from the sacred courts, the dust of limestone that coated everything in this city of perpetual construction. The sound was overwhelming. Aramaic, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Coptic, and a dozen diaspora dialects, all competing for space in the narrow stone corridors between buildings. The children in every Jewish household that morning were learning their lines for the Passover meal that night. The youngest child would ask the question that opened the Seder, the ritual meal. The question that had been asked every Passover for centuries: why is this night different from all other nights? Nobody that morning knew the full answer, but something was happening that day that made it different from every day that had ever existed before it and every day that would ever come after it. It was not visible to eyes that lacked the context. You could not measure it with any instrument available in the 1st century or the 21st. It was something occurring simultaneously at every level of reality: political, religious, historical, cosmic, eternal. The Son of God was being crucified, and the world, without fully understanding it, would never be the same again. This is the story of that day, not from the comfortable distance of abstract theology, but from the stone streets of Jerusalem itself. We are going to walk the same cobblestones walked by Roman soldiers, Galilean women, temple priests, market merchants, wags and pilgrims from every corner of the Jewish world. We are going to try to hear the noise of that city, understand the architecture of time that God had been building for centuries to bring everything to exactly that point. And we are going to stop Requiem with the respect and attention that day deserves before the most disorienting and most liberating reality in all of human history. Because Good Friday of the year 33 is not a date in a history book. It is the axis around which all of existence turns. Let's begin. To understand what happened that day, we need to dismantle the image of Jerusalem that most of us carry in our heads and build a different one. The Jerusalem that most people picture is a confused mixture of images from different centuries. The Ottoman walls built in the 1500s, the medieval minarets, the Byzantine domes, the yellowish stone of the Western Wall. That Jerusalem is beautiful and significant, but it is not the Jerusalem of the year 33. The Jerusalem of year 33 was a city under active construction, literally. Herod the Great had launched, decades earlier, one of the most ambitious construction projects in the ancient world: the complete renovation of the temple and the expansion of the entire platform of Mount Moriah. When Herod died, his sons and successors continued the work. In the year 33, Herod's temple was technically operational, but also technically unfinished. Scaffolding, stonecutters, the white dust of limestone, the sound of chisels and hammers were all part of the everyday landscape of the city. Visitors from Rome or Alexandria who came for Passover would have arrived to find a construction zone of staggering scale surrounding one of the most impressive religious complexes in the known world. The city itself was in perpetual motion, expanding to the north and west, layering new neighborhoods over the ruins of older ones. The upper city, where the powerful priests and the aristocrats of the Sanhedrin lived, occupied the western hill. Archaeology has found and documented those residences: floor mosaics, painted plaster on walls, private ritual baths called mikvaot, stone vessels used for purity regulations. These were comfortable, sophisticated homes that would have been recognizable in any major city of the Roman Empire. The lower city was something else entirely: tight, labyrinthine, with alleys that climbed and descended the slopes of the Ophel Hill, with stone houses, sharing walls and cisterns, with the layered smell of cooked food, livestock, incense, and the simple density of humanity that is the smell of any ancient city packed beyond its comfortable capacity. The Mount Ophel district, immediately south of the Temple Mount, was probably the oldest continuously inhabited part of Jerusalem, and it carried that age in every cracked stone. Now add Passover to this already dense city. In normal times, Jerusalem held somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people. It was a significant, but not enormous city by the standards of the Roman world. Rome had over 1 million inhabitants. Alexandria in Egypt may have reached 500,000. But Jerusalem had something no other city in the world had: the Temple. And the Temple meant that 3 times a year, during the pilgrimage festivals, the city was transformed beyond recognition. During Passover, historians and demographers calculate that the population could multiply by 3 or 4 times, somewhere between 200 and 300,000 people in a city built for 80,000. The pilgrims came from every corner of the Jewish world, from Galilee to the north, from Perea and the Decapolis east of the Jordan River, from Egypt, from the Cyrenaica region of North Africa, from Cyprus, from Asia Minor, from the island of Crete, from Rome itself, from Babylon and Parthia, from the farthest eastern reaches of the diaspora. Every single one of them needed somewhere to sleep. The city inside the walls could not absorb everyone, so the hills surrounding Jerusalem in Passover season became an enormous camp. The slopes of the Mount of Olives, the Kidron Valley, the hillsides of Mount Scopus, everything covered with tents and campfires and the sound of thousands of conversations in Aramaic, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Coptic, and all the dialects the diaspora had developed in its various geographies over centuries. The olive groves east of the city, where families had camped for generations during the festival weeks, would have been thick with people who had walked days or weeks to be there. This was the most charged, the most dense, the most emotionally ignited atmosphere that existed anywhere in the first-century Mediterranean world. These were not tourists. These were people for whom this journey was the spiritual axis of their entire year. People who had saved money and planned for months, and walked hundreds of miles to stand in this city and offer sacrifice in the one place on earth where they believed God had chosen to put his name. And in that atmosphere, on that Friday morning in spring, began the most important day in all of human history. Jerusalem in year 33 lived under a triple political tension that is essential to understand if you want to understand what happened. At the highest level was Rome. The Roman Empire had governed Judea directly as a Roman province since the year 6 of the Common Era, under the administration of a prefect appointed directly by the emperor. In year 33, that prefect was Pontius Pilate, who had arrived in the position in the year 26. Pilate did not normally live in Jerusalem. His official residence was Caesarea Maritima, the port city that Herod the Great had built on the Mediterranean coast with harbor engineering that stunned the ancient world. But during the pilgrimage festivals, Pilate transferred to Jerusalem with additional military reinforcements, because the concentration of devout and emotionally charged Jews around the temple always represented a potential risk of civil disturbance. Pilate was not a beloved governor. Jewish sources from the period describe him as stubborn, prone to provocation, not particularly interested in understanding the culture he administered. He had already clashed multiple times with the Jerusalem leadership over issues of religious sensitivity. He was a man doing a difficult administrative job in a city he did not fully understand, surrounded by a population he viewed primarily as a security challenge. That personal profile would matter enormously on this particular Friday. At the intermediate level was the priestly aristocracy, with the high priest at its head. In year 33, that position was occupied by Caiaphas, son-in-law of the former high priest Annas, who, according to the Gospels, continued to exercise decisive influence, even without the official title. The high priest and the Sanhedrin, the supreme council of 71 members that administered Jewish religious, legal, and to some extent civil affairs, had reached an unspoken agreement with Rome that allowed them to maintain their authority and privileges in exchange for guaranteeing order and cooperation with imperial administration. It was a fragile arrangement, morally questionable, pragmatically stable. And it was exactly that arrangement that produced the extraordinary alliance between Roman power and priestly power that condemned Jesus. At street level was the people, pilgrims, craftsmen, merchants, farmers who had come for the festival, all of them with their own hopes, frustrations, loyalties, and fears. This was not a uniform mass. There were those who had acclaimed Jesus at the triumphal entry 5 days earlier, convinced he was the Davidic Messiah who would restore Israel's kingdom. There were those who watched him with skepticism or indifference. There were those who had heard his teaching and felt that something in it was completely different from anything they had heard before. And there were those in the leadership who had decided, long before that Friday, that he could not be allowed to continue. To understand Good Friday in its depth, you have to understand what Passover was for a first-century Jew, not as an academic exercise, but as an exercise in historical empathy. Try to feel your way into that skin. Pesach was not simply an annual holiday. It was the foundational event of all of Israel's national and religious identity. The liberation from Egypt was not, for a first-century Jew, a remote and abstract historical event. It was the moment in which God had established who they were, redeemed slaves, chosen people, a nation born from the sovereign act of their God, and God had not wanted that moment to fade into memory with the passing generations. In Exodus chapter 12, the text that every Jewish family knew by heart, God had given the instructions with an almost obsessive precision. On the 10th of the month, set apart the lamb. On the 14th, in the afternoon, sacrifice it. Take the blood and spread it on the doorposts. Eat the meat that same night, roasted over fire, with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. Eat with your belts fastened, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, like someone ready to leave at a moment's notice. And then this instruction, which is perhaps the most theologically loaded of all, when your children ask you, "What does this ceremony mean to you?" Then tell them, "It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians." Exodus chapter 12, verse 27. Not, when your children ask you, explain to them that long ago something important happened to our ancestors. Tell them it happened to us. The Passover was not the celebration of something that happened to someone else. It was the celebration of something that, through the ritual, each generation relived as their own. The rabbis taught explicitly that each person in each generation was required to see themselves as if they personally had gone out from Egypt. The whole point of the Seder meal, the questions, the symbolic foods, the retelling of the story, was to collapse the distance between the past event and the present participant. This is why Passover produced such intense emotional and spiritual energy. For a Jewish family sitting down to the Seder in Jerusalem in the year 33, the liberation from Egypt was not history. It was autobiography. The Passover lamb was the absolute center of the entire ritual, and the details that the law prescribed for that lamb are, in the light of Good Friday, absolutely staggering. The lamb had to be without blemish, no injury, no disease, no visible imperfection. The priests examined them carefully at the temple gate. Any defect disqualified the animal. The lamb had to be set apart on the 10th of Nisan, 4 days before the sacrifice. During those 4 days, the family kept it with them. They fed it, they knew it by sight. Some traditions suggest they even gave it a name. The relationship between the family and the lamb was not purely transactional. On the day of the sacrifice, the 14th of Nisan, each family brought their lamb to the temple. They did not sacrifice it outside, at home. They brought it to the temple courts, to the place of sacrifice, and there, with their own hands, under the supervision of the priests, they sacrificed it themselves. It was a personal, direct act. The priests formed lines in the court, holding gold and silver basins. When each family's lamb was sacrificed and the blood poured out, the priests caught it, passed it hand to hand down the line to the altar, and poured it at the base. While this was happening, the Levites sang the Hallel, the songs of praise from Psalms 113 through 118, music that filled the entire temple precinct and spilled over the rooftops of the city, the sound of thousands of voices singing the praise of God. mixed with the sound and smell of thousands of lambs being sacrificed in a relatively short window of time on a single afternoon, composed an experience of sensory and spiritual intensity almost impossible to imagine for someone who has never lived it. That was the context. That was the atmosphere. And in that precise context, on that precise day, the true Lamb of God was being led to his sacrifice. The Apostle Paul would write it years later, with an economy of words that still makes readers stop. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. But the correspondence between the Passover lamb and Jesus is not a theological metaphor that Paul found useful after the fact. It is a literal, chronological, detailed correspondence that can only be explained by acknowledging that whoever designed it knew the end from the beginning. The 10th of Nisan, the day the lambs were set apart and brought into the family's home, was the day of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. While families were bringing their lambs to the temple courts, the crowd was acclaiming the one whom John the Baptist had pointed to 3 years earlier at the Jordan River, saying, "Look, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." John chapter 1, verse 29. The 14th of Nisan, the day the lambs were sacrificed in the temple, was Good Friday of the year 33. The correspondence was not approximate. It was exact. It was the signature of God on the document of history, the one who had given the Passover instructions in the Sinai desert 1400 years earlier, had designed every detail of that ritual, knowing it was a forward-pointing shadow of the sacrifice that would occur at the fullness of time. There was no coincidence in the date. There was an infinite mind working on timescales that the human mind can barely contemplate. The 4 days between the 10th and the 14th of Nisan, the days the lamb was kept in the family's home before the sacrifice, were also the 4 days that Jesus spent in Jerusalem before the crucifixion. And during those 4 days, in the temple and in public debates, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the Herodians, all sent their best representatives to examine him, to question him, to find some defect in his answers, some error in his theology, some contradiction in his teaching. They found nothing. Pilate himself, after the trial, would say it publicly. "I find no basis for a charge against this man." Luke chapter 23, verse 4. The lamb had been examined. It was without blemish, and on the 14th of Nisan, in the afternoon, it was ready to be offered. To fully understand Good Friday, we need to pause at Thursday night, because what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane is the prologue, without which Friday lacks its full depth. After the Last Supper, Jesus left Jerusalem with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley toward the Mount of Olives. The Garden of Gethsemane, whose name in Aramaic means oil press, was a private garden on the lower slopes of the mount, probably with ancient olive trees and the press that the name evokes. It was a place Jesus had gone frequently with his disciples, a known place, a place he chose that night deliberately. The Gospel of Luke describes what happened there with a phrase that has intrigued readers for centuries, "and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground." Luke chapter 22, verse 44. Medicine knows this condition. It is called hematidrosis, and it occurs in states of extreme stress when the capillaries surrounding the sweat glands rupture and blood mixes with the sweat. It is not common. It is the result of a psychological pressure that is at the edge of what the human body can sustain. It has been documented in soldiers before battle, in prisoners awaiting execution, in people facing catastrophic loss. It requires a level of anticipated dread that most human beings never experience. What was Jesus carrying in that garden that produced that kind of pressure? The text of Luke is direct. He was in agony, and that agony was about what was coming, what he was consciously choosing to accept. The words he directed to the Father in that prayer are perhaps the most revealing words in all of Scripture regarding the full humanity of the Son of God. "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Luke chapter 22, verse 42. There is a will that would prefer this not to happen, and there is another will that chooses it anyway. Both are real, both are genuine. and the second overcomes the first, not because the suffering does not matter, but because what will be obtained through that suffering matters more. This is not a detached philosophical calculation. It is a human being in bloody sweat, choosing love over self-preservation in the most visceral way imaginable. What followed in Gethsemane was an arrest that condensed the entire tension of what was happening into a few minutes. Judas arrived with a cohort of Roman soldiers and officials sent by the chief priests, carrying torches and weapons. The gesture he used to identify Jesus, a kiss, the greeting of a disciple to his teacher, became the most famous symbol of betrayal in all of human history. There is a cruelty in the specificity of that gesture that time has not softened. But there is a moment in the arrest that is often passed over quickly. Peter, impulsive and fierce as always, drew a sword and cut off the ear of a servant of the high priest. The Gospel of John tells us the servant's name was Malchus. That detail of an eyewitness, the specific name of an otherwise minor character, gives the narrative the texture of something that actually happened. And Jesus, in that moment of maximum tension, surrounded by soldiers, seconds from arrest, bent down and restored Malchus's ear. That gesture is one of the most extraordinary in all the Gospel narrative. In the moment when everything was collapsing, in the moment when violence was about to explode in every direction, Jesus performed a miracle of healing for the servant of his enemy. And then he said to Peter, "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" Matthew chapter 26, verse 53. 12 legions of angels. The imagery is not incidental. It is a statement of absolute sovereignty in the middle of a situation that looked like complete powerlessness. What was happening was not a defeat he could not avoid. It was a choice he was making actively, in every moment, with full awareness of what it cost and what it would accomplish. What followed the arrest was a series of trials that legal scholars have analyzed for centuries, and that violate systematically the norms of the Jewish legal system itself. The process was supposed to begin only during daylight. It began at night. The process could not be held during a festival. It was held during Passover. A death sentence required a second session the following day for confirmation. There was no second session. The witnesses were supposed to be examined separately, and their testimonies were required to agree. The witnesses contradicted each other, and the Sanhedrin proceeded anyway. This was not a judicial process. It was a conclusion searching for the arguments to justify itself. The Sanhedrin had made the decision before the process began. The trial was the theatrical performance that gave legal appearance to what was already settled. The final question that Caiaphas asked Jesus cuts through all the theater and arrives at the actual core of what was at stake. "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Matthew chapter 26, verse 63. And Jesus answered with an affirmation that left no room for ambiguity. What sealed the trial was not any accusation about his actions or his associations. It was his declaration of identity. That is the only reason Good Friday was necessary. Not because Jesus had done anything that deserved that death under any recognizable system of justice, but because he claimed to be who he was, and that claim was intolerable to those who had built their entire world on the assumption that no one could be. While the trials were unfolding inside, Peter was in the courtyard of the high priest's palace. He had followed at a distance. He had managed to get inside. He was nearby. And 3 times, in the space of a few hours, he denied knowing the man he had promised to follow to the death. The Gospel of Luke captures the most devastating moment with an economy of words that causes the heart to contract. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Luke chapter 22, verse 61. In the middle of everything that was happening, in the middle of the trial and the abuse and the brutality of that night, Jesus found a moment to turn and look at Peter. There were no words. There did not need to be. The rooster had just crowed, and Peter went outside and wept bitterly. There is something in that weeping that needs to be understood correctly. The man who weeps like that is not a man who has abandoned his faith. He is a man who loves too much not to be destroyed by his own betrayal. The man who does not love does not weep that way. The weeping of Peter is painful precisely because his love was genuine. And Jesus knew that, which is why in his first post-resurrection appearance, according to the Gospel of Mark, The angel gives a specific instruction: go, tell his disciples and Peter. Mark chapter 16, verse 7. And Peter, the most shattered man of all, receives a special individual mention in the invitation to the greatest astonishment in history. That has always been the pattern. Good Friday is not the end for those who have failed. It is precisely the beginning of their restoration. The dawn of Friday, as April 3rd, year 33, found Jesus already in the hands of Pilate. The Jewish leaders could not enter the praetorium, the governor's residence, during his visits to Jerusalem, because doing so during Passover would have made them ritually impure. They could manage the death of an innocent man, but they could not risk ceremonial contamination. The irony of that religious scrupulosity in the context of what they were doing is one of the darkest in the gospel narrative. Pilate came out to hear them. And what followed was one of the most thoroughly documented acts of political cowardice in ancient history. Pilate examined Jesus. He questioned him. He arrived at a clear conclusion and stated it publicly. I find no basis for a charge against this man. He tried to release him by offering the Passover custom of releasing one prisoner, expecting the crowd to choose Jesus. He sent him to Herod Antipas, hoping to pass the responsibility sideways. He offered to have him flogged and released as a compromise. He argued. He negotiated. He stalled. But the political pressure was unbearable. The veiled threat that releasing Jesus would prove he was no friend of Caesar. The fragile balance his administration had managed with the priestly aristocracy, the fear of a riot during Passover that would be reported back to Rome, all of it weighed more than his own conviction. There is a moment in Matthew's gospel narrative that is almost unbearable in its symbolic weight. Pilate called for water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I'm innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility. Matthew chapter 27, verse 24. The gesture exempted him from nothing. Responsibility cannot be washed away with water. But the gesture does reveal something. Even the man who condemned him knew he was innocent. The spotless lamb was declared spotless even by his executioners, the official representative of the most powerful empire on earth, with full legal authority to free or condemn, publicly declared this man not guilty, and then condemned him anyway. That contradiction will echo through history for as long as history lasts. Before being taken to Golgotha, Jesus was flogged. The Roman flogging was not a minor punishment that preceded crucifixion as a kind of administrative preliminary. It was in itself a torment that could kill. The instrument used, called a flagrum, was a whip with multiple leather straps from which hung fragments of bone or metal. The effect on skin and muscle tissue was devastating. Josephus and other ancient sources describe men dying from flogging alone. The Gospels narrate the flogging with the same sobriety that characterizes their entire description of Jesus' physical suffering. They do not dramatize, they do not elaborate. They simply record the fact that restraint is, paradoxically, more powerful than any detailed description. It trusts the reader to fill the space with comprehension. The prophet Isaiah, writing approximately 700 years before Good Friday, had written in chapter 53, verse 5, "By his wounds we are healed." The Hebrew word translated as wounds in that verse is habara, which specifically denotes a bruise, a wound produced by a blow. Isaiah was not using a generic metaphor about suffering. He was describing, with 700 years of lead time, exactly what happened in that courtyard of the praetorium on the morning of Good Friday. After the flogging, the soldiers added an act of mockery that, read in the light of theology, turns out to be an inadvertent proclamation. They put a crown of thorns on his head. They gave him a robe of purple, the color of royalty. They put a reed in his right hand as a scepter, and they knelt before him in mockery. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They were mocking, but they were telling the truth. Since Genesis chapter 3, thorns are the symbol of the curse that entered creation with sin. "It will produce thorns and thistles for you," God said to Adam after the fall. And at Golgotha, the second Adam was crowned with those same thorns, taking onto his head the curse that the first Adam had brought upon creation. The soldiers who braided that crown thought they were creating an instrument of humiliation. They were creating, without knowing it, the most loaded symbol in the history of human suffering. The curse itself, pressed down onto the head of the one who came to bear it. The road from the Praetorium to Golgotha ran through the heart of Jerusalem. It was a city packed with Passover pilgrims. Every street was full of people going and coming, buying and selling, carrying animals for sacrifice, arguing the affairs of the day. And through that crowd, an exhausted man, weakened by a night without sleep and devastated by the flogging, carried a wooden beam toward the place of his execution. At some point along the way, the weight was too much. The soldiers drafted a man named Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the countryside, and forced him to carry the cross behind Jesus. Mark identifies Simon as the father of Alexander and Rufus, two names that appear in Paul's letter to the Romans as well-known members of the believing community. The detail is the kind that only matters if someone's readers knew who Alexander and Rufus were. It is evidence that Simon of Cyrene, the man who was compelled to carry another man's cross, ended up encountering the one who carried it, and his family was transformed by that encounter. Compulsion became conversion, imposition became initiation. The Gospel of Luke records something that no other gospel mentions, that as the procession moved through the streets, there were women who were weeping and mourning for Jesus. And Jesus, in that state, exhausted, beaten, carrying the weight of wood and something incomparably heavier, stopped and spoke to them. He did not complain about his own suffering. He spoke to them about what was coming upon Jerusalem if it did not repent. Even on the road to Golgotha, his attention was on others. Golgotha, from the Aramaic for place of the skull, was located outside the city walls near a main gate. Its exact identification is one of the most studied questions in historical archaeology. The strongest tradition, supported by continuity of ecclesiastical memory from the 1st century and confirmed by modern archaeology, places it at the site where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre now stands inside the current Old City. The fact that it is inside the walls today does not contradict the biblical narrative. The current walls of Jerusalem are Ottoman, built in the 16th century. In the 1st century, that location was outside the walls of the period, beside a major road, visible to everyone entering and leaving the city through the northern gate. That visibility was intentional. Roman crucifixions were not carried out in hidden places. They were placed where the maximum number of people would see them. Rome wanted every pilgrim arriving in Jerusalem for Passover to pass by and understand what happened to those who challenged imperial authority. What Rome did not know was that in this case, the intention would be entirely inverted. The one being lifted on that cross was not being humiliated. He was being exalted. The one who appeared to be the object of Rome's power was, from every dimension that ultimately matters, its master. It was 9 in the morning, the 3rd hour in the Jewish division of the day, when the crucifixion began. The Gospel of Mark records it with precise brevity. They crucified him. Mark chapter 15, verse 25. Jesus was crucified between two common criminals, to his right and to his left. The one who had said the first would be last was in the position of honor in shame, flanked by those whom society considered the worst. And even from there, he was still the one who changed lives. One of the two criminals crucified beside him said something that no one could have expected, given the circumstances and the state he was in. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Luke chapter 23, verse 42. And from the cross, Jesus answered with the most generous promise in all the gospel narrative. Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Luke chapter 23, verse 43. No initiation process, no probationary period, no liturgy, no intermediary. In the moment that man recognized who was beside him and expressed a faith as naked as it was possible for faith to be, he received the most complete answer available. That is the gospel in its purest form, distilled to its absolute essence, not after improvement, not after demonstration of worthiness. In that state, from that cross, with those words, the first word Jesus spoke from the cross was a prayer, not a complaint, not a curse, not a lament, a prayer of intercession for the people who were nailing him there. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Luke chapter 23, verse 34. This sentence has been commented on. preached and meditated over for 2,000 years, and it still is, every time it is read with full attention. One of the most disorienting things a human being has ever said, not because it is difficult to say in abstract, because it was said in that context, at that moment, by that man, with the nails freshly hammered and the cross freshly raised. The forgiveness Jesus was asking for was not for a future offense or a hypothetical one. It was for the one happening at that precise instant. And the reason he gave, "They do not know what they are doing," is not an excuse that reduces guilt. It is a comprehension of the depth of human blindness. Those who were crucifying him did not understand the scale of what they were doing. If they had understood, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 8, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. John was the only male disciple standing at the foot of the cross. The women were there, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there. From the cross, with everything that was happening, Jesus looked at his mother and the beloved disciple and said, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." John chapter 19, verse 27. In that moment, Jesus was doing multiple things simultaneously that only the fullness of his person could do at the same time. He was bearing the sin of the world. He was fulfilling centuries of prophecy. He was defeating death. And he was making sure that his aging mother had someone to care for her. The God who sustains the universe by his word took a moment for the concrete details of one specific woman's life in one specific city at one specific moment. That says something about who he is that no theological statement can say as well as that gesture. The infinite attended to the particular. The cosmic paused for the personal. This is not a God who manages humanity at scale and ignores individuals. This is a God who, while dying for everyone, made specific arrangements for one specific person. At noon, when the sun should have been at its brightest point of the day, darkness fell over the whole land. The Gospel of Luke is specific. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. Luke chapter 23, verse 44. 3 hours of darkness in broad midday. Astronomers are unambiguous on one point. Solar eclipses are impossible during a full moon. Passover always occurs on a full moon, the 14th of Nisan by the lunar calendar. What happened during those 3 hours cannot be explained within the normal categories of astronomical science. It was not an eclipse. It was not a storm cloud. The Gospel writers describe it as a cosmic event that had no natural mechanism. It was the response of creation to what was happening within it. The sun could not continue shining with its routine normalcy, while the author of light carried the darkness of all of human history. Creation is not a passive backdrop against which the story of redemption unfolds. Creation responded. The sky went dark because what was happening on that hill was too significant for the sky to ignore. At 3 in the afternoon, the 9th hour in the Jewish system, came the cry that has confused and disturbed readers for 2,000 years, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani." In Aramaic, the language of Jesus, the words rang over Golgotha, and those standing nearby, hearing Eloi, thought he was calling for Elijah. Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. But Jesus was not calling for Elijah. He was reciting the opening of Psalm 22. Psalm 22, written by David approximately 1,000 years before Good Friday, begins with exactly those words. And what follows in that psalm is a description of crucifixion so precise that it causes the mind to stop in stunned wonder. Surrounded by enemies who mock and jeer, heart melted like wax, strength dried up like baked clay, mocked by onlookers who wag their heads, hands and feet pierced, clothes divided by casting lots. Every one of those details is in Psalm 22. Every one of them was fulfilled at Golgotha, and crucifixion had not even been invented as a method of execution when David wrote those words. He was describing from the inside of an experience he was having, something whose full meaning would not become clear for another 10 centuries. Jesus was not improvising a cry of despair. He was reciting the sacred text that described exactly what he was living, with the full consciousness of someone who knows the end of the text he is quoting. And the end of Psalm 22 is not despair, it is triumph. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, "He has done it." Psalm 22, verse 31. The cry of abandonment was real. The desolation was real. The Son of God, bearing the sin of humanity, experienced the separation from God that sin produces. That is exactly what had to happen for the debt to be paid completely, not symbolically declared cancelled. Paid in the full experience of the cost of that debt. Then Jesus said, "I am thirsty." John chapter 19, verse 28. John adds, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that Scripture would be fulfilled, he said this. Psalm 22, verse 15 says, "My mouth is dried up like a potsherd." Psalm 69, verse 21 says, "They gave me vinegar for my thirst." Even those two simple, physical, utterly human words were part of the text being fulfilled line by line. But there is something more in those two words. The one who spoke them is the same one who told the Samaritan woman, "Whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst again." John chapter 4, verse 14. The one who had promised that rivers of living water would flow from the hearts of those who believed in him. The one who was the source of all life was thirsty. The paradox is too large to be accidental. It is the depth of the incarnation carried to its farthest extreme. The sixth word from the cross is perhaps the most theologically dense of all, tetelestai, in Greek, a single word. The language in which John's Gospel was written, the language of commerce across the Eastern Mediterranean, the language in which contracts were written and debts were recorded, and in the commercial world of the first century, tetelestai was the word stamped across debt documents when the debt had been paid in full, not partially, not with a promise to continue paying completely, to the very last fraction. Paul, in his letter to the Colossians, describes what happened at that moment in legal terms. Having cancelled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us, he has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. Colossians chapter 2, verse 14. The charge of our legal indebtedness, the complete record of everything humanity owed to a holy God for every transgression, every act of selfishness, every moment of cruelty, every turning away, every failure of love, the complete record, nailed to the cross, stamped with the seal, paid in full. This was not the cry of someone defeated. It was the triumphant declaration of someone who had completed exactly what he came to complete. The last word from the cross was also a prayer. The arc that began with "Father, forgive them," ended with "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Luke chapter 23, verse 46. John adds that, having said this, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. John chapter 19, verse 30. Not, he was deprived of life. Not, he died. He gave up his spirit. The same sovereignty that had characterized every moment of that day, from the choice not to flee Gethsemane, to the miracle performed for Malchus, to the promise given to the dying thief, to the arrangements made for his mother, reached to the very end. As he had said, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again." John chapter 10, verse 18. At the exact moment Jesus gave up his spirit, in the temple less than a kilometer away, something happened that paralyzed every priest who was on duty at that instant, something that would be talked about for generations, something that the traditions of the Jewish people would preserve in their memory long after the temple itself had been destroyed. The curtain of the temple tore from top to bottom. This was not an ordinary curtain of normal proportions. Historical sources from the period Gene, including Josephus and the Talmud, describe it as a hanging of colossal dimensions, approximately 18 meters high and 9 meters wide, woven from fine linen, purple, crimson, and blue, several centimeters thick, so heavy that hundreds of priests were needed to move it when it was necessary to do so. It hung across the entrance to the most holy place, the innermost sanctuary of the temple, called in Hebrew the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies was the throne room of the divine presence, the place where God had chosen to dwell among his people in a uniquely concentrated way. The Ark of the Covenant had once rested there. The high priest could enter only once a year, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and only with blood of animals in his hands to make propitiation for the sins of the people. Entry by anyone else at any other time meant death. The curtain was not merely a physical barrier. It was the theological boundary between what humanity could access and what it could not. Between the space where priests could enter and the space where only the most authorized representative of the entire nation could enter once a year with great preparation and fear. And it tore, not from the bottom, where a human hand could reach, from the top. The tearing from top to bottom is the sign of divine agency. Human beings tear things from the bottom up. A force from above tears from the top down. This was not an accident. This was not structural damage from an earthquake, though an earthquake did occur. This was God himself, pulling back the curtain that he himself had put there, announcing to every priest in the temple courts that the system that curtain represented had reached its completion. The system that required a human intermediary to approach God, the system that kept the vast majority of people at a permanent distance from the divine presence. That system had fulfilled its function as shadow and symbol. The way was open, not for the high priest once a year, for everyone who wore the righteousness of the Lamb at every moment, in every circumstance, without intermediary, without barrier, directly. The letter to the Hebrews would express it this way: "Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain," that is, his body, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 and 20. The curtain was his flesh. His death was the tearing, and the way that was opened has never been closed again. Matthew also records that the earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs opened. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Matthew chapter 27, verses 52 and 53. Matthew presents this as a verifiable historical fact, not as vision or allegory. His readers in Jerusalem could ask their neighbors about it. It was something that living people at the time of the Gospel's writing could confirm or deny. What this passage signals theologically is of enormous depth. In the moment Jesus died, death began to yield, not yet definitively and universally. That would come in the resurrection and in the final resurrection at the end of time, but as an anticipatory sign, a first crack in the wall of death, a demonstration of the power that had been released at Golgotha. Death could not contain his power even when he died, how much less when he rose. The Roman centurion who had supervised the crucifixion had seen many executions. It was part of his job. He was trained not to be afraid of anything the earth could produce. But what he saw that day was different from everything he had seen before. Matthew records his reaction to what the centurion and those who were with him guarding Jesus saw. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Matthew chapter 27, verse 54. A Roman soldier trained for fearlessness was overcome by the weight of what he had witnessed. The dignity with which the condemned had borne everything, the words spoken from the cross, the darkness at midday, the earthquake that followed his death. Everything together produced in that man a recognition that his lips expressed with the only words he had available for it. He was not a theologian. He did not have the vocabulary of Jewish messianism or of Hellenistic philosophy. He was a military man watching an execution he had ordered carried out, and he declared the truth that the religious experts of that generation, with all their vocabulary and all their learning, could not bring themselves to say. It was not what he had been taught that moved him. It was what he had seen, and what he had seen was sufficient. It has always been sufficient. When the soldiers came to verify the deaths in order to remove the bodies before the Sabbath, they found that Jesus was already dead. They did not break his legs as they did with the other two. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and John, who was there, records what came out with an unusual insistence on his own credibility as a witness. One of the soldiers pierced Jesus and side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, And he testifies so that you also may believe. John chapter 19, verses 34 and 35. John was there. He saw this, and he considered it so important, so full of meaning, so necessary for those who were not present to believe, that he interrupted his narrative to insist on his own reliability in a way that appears nowhere else in his gospel. He is not merely reporting a detail, he is staking his credibility on it. The physiological explanation most accepted today is that the spear reached the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart, and possibly the heart itself, and the presence of what John calls water is explained by the pleural or pericardial effusion that can accompany death by crucifixion. The blood and water are medically coherent with what John describes, but the significance of that detail is not physiological, it is theological. In the biblical tradition, water purifies externally and blood atones internally. Both flow from the side of the sacrificed lamb. The fact that they came from the same wound, the same side, the same heart, the same sacrifice, is the signature of completion on an event that had been designed from before the foundation of the world. And not breaking the bones of Jesus fulfilled with exact precision the prescription from Exodus chapter 12, verse 46, regarding the Passover lamb. Do not break any of the bones. The Passover lamb was not to have its bones broken. The Lamb of God did not. Even in the most forensically trivial details from the soldiers' perspective, the text written centuries earlier was being fulfilled with a precision that leaves no room for accident. There is something in the death of Jesus that produces in the people who had followed him from a distance an effect that his public life had not produced. It brings them out of hiding. Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin, a wealthy man, a man of position, a man who had everything to lose. The Gospel of John describes him as a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. The Sanhedrin had made the decision to execute Jesus. Joseph was a member of the Sanhedrin, but, according to Luke chapter 23, verse 51, had not consented to their decision and action. After the death of Jesus, Joseph did something that required a courage that the previous days had not shown in him. He went directly to Pilate and asked for the body, publicly, in front of everyone, assuming all the consequences of that visible declaration of where he stood. Nicodemus, the Pharisee who had come to Jesus at night, according to John chapter 3, also appeared, but now it was daytime. He was not hiding, and he brought a quantity of spices so extraordinary, approximately 33 kilograms of myrrh and aloes, that it was the burial of a king. John chapter 19, verse 39. The one who had come to Jesus in the darkness came now in full daylight, in full view of everyone, to honor the dead teacher. The death of Jesus had produced in him exactly the opposite of what his enemies had calculated. Not silence, but declaration. Not concealment, but exposure. This has always been the pattern. The cross does not extinguish. The cross reveals and activates. It reveals who we really are and activates what in us had been dormant. The people who were hidden before the cross came out of hiding at the cross. The people who were bold before the cross ran away at the cross. And the people who were shattered by the cross became, after what happened 3 days later, the most unstoppable force the ancient world had ever encountered. The prophet Isaiah, chapter 53, verse 9, had written, "He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death." The most dispossessed man in his death, the one crucified with no possessions, was buried in the tomb of one of the wealthiest men in Jerusalem. Even the tomb was part of the script written 700 years before. Joseph had a new tomb cut in rock in a garden near Golgotha, in which no one had yet been laid. He gave it for the teacher. It was nearby. That proximity allowed them to complete the burial before the sunset that would begin the Sabbath. When the sun set over Jerusalem on that Good Friday, the city entered the silence of the Sabbath. Streets emptied, markets closed, households lit with the Sabbath lamps. Families gathered around tables with the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs and the wine of the Passover, recounting the story of liberation from Egypt, singing the psalms of praise, doing it as God had commanded from generation to generation, so that it would never be forgotten what God had done. In each of those households that night, The youngest child asked the question that opened the Seder. Why is this night different from all other nights? The answer that families gave was the story of the Exodus, but in that Sabbath of Passover, the most complete answer to that question was what had happened that day at Golgotha. That night was different from all other nights, because the true lamb had been sacrificed, because the liberation that the Exodus had only prefigured had been accomplished, because the most powerful Pharaoh of all, death itself, had received the blow from which it would never recover. They did not know it yet. The Sunday at dawn, when the women came to the tomb and found the stone rolled away, would begin the revelation of what Good Friday had initiated. But that night, in the silence of the Passover Sabbath, in a sealed and guarded tomb outside Jerusalem, rested the body of the one who would accomplish the ultimate redemption. And the stone that rolled across the entrance of that tomb, with its solid, final sound, rang out like the ending of everything. But it was not the ending. There is something in the structure of Good Friday that can only be explained by admitting that there is a mind behind history that operates on timescales that transcend the human. The sacrificial system of the Passover lamb was established approximately in 1440 before the Common Era. Psalm 22 was written approximately in the year 1000. Isaiah chapter 53 was written approximately in 700. The prophecy of Zechariah about the one who would be pierced was written approximately in 500. All of them written by different authors in different centuries, in completely different historical circumstances, all converging with a precision that makes the statistical probabilities of coincidence mathematically irrelevant, at that single point in space and time. Friday, April 3rd, year 33 of the Common Era, at Golgotha. At the hour of the afternoon when the Passover lambs were being sacrificed in the temple, this was not an accident of history. It was the execution of a plan determined before the first atom of creation existed. The book of Revelation describes the lamb as slain from the creation of the world. Revelation chapter 13, verse 8. The sacrifice at Golgotha was not God's response to the problem of sin, as if something had happened that God did not anticipate and required an emergency solution. It was the execution of the plan that was fixed before the first word of creation was spoken. The temple in Jerusalem was physically destroyed by Roman armies in the year 70 of the Common Era, exactly as Jesus had prophesied when he told his disciples that not one stone would be left on another. The curtain that had torn on Good Friday was destroyed along with the building that had contained it, but the access to the presence of God that the tearing of the curtain had inaugurated did not depend on the building. It depended on the sacrifice, and the sacrifice is eternal. The blood of the Lamb has not lost its power. The way that was opened at Golgotha is still open. The Father still waits in the presence that the curtain no longer separates from us. Living in the light of Good Friday means living with the awareness that you do not need to earn God's love, because you already have it. You are not building your road toward Him because He has already built His road toward you. You are not offering sacrifices to calm a distant deity, because the only sacrifice necessary was already offered and accepted. And what that produces is not passivity or indifference. It produces exactly the opposite. A gratitude more powerful than any obligation, a love that responds freely to what it has received, a life that flows from the same source from which all true life flows, from the one who said, "Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." John chapter 7, verse 38. Good Friday does not produce grateful slaves. It produces free children who live from the abundance of what they have received. The question that every person who lived in Jerusalem that week had to answer in the days and weeks that followed was the same question each of us has to answer now. It was not an abstract theological question. It was the most personal and most urgent question any human life can face. Who was this man? The people who had been in the streets that Friday had seen things they could not ignore. The people in the temple when the curtain tore could not pretend it had not happened. The centurion who had directed the execution had spoken aloud what he had seen. Those who had beaten their chests as they walked away from Golgotha had felt the weight of what they had witnessed in their own bodies. And in the days that followed, when reports began to circulate through Jerusalem of an empty tomb and appearances in which the crucified man showed himself alive, The question returned with an urgency that admitted no postponement. What do you do with this man? That is the question Pilate could not answer rightly. It is the question the centurion answered with confession. It is the question the repentant thief answered with the most naked and most sufficient faith in all the gospel narrative. And it is the question that every person who hears this story has to answer. Not because it is a religious obligation, but because the reality of Good Friday, if it is true, if the blood was shed, if the curtain was torn, if the tetelestai was spoken, does not permit indifference. It does not permit a comfortable, "Oh, I will think about it when I have time." If it is true, it is the most important news any human being can receive. If the price has already been paid, if the debt has already been cancelled, if the way has already been opened, then the only rational response is to enter. 2,000 years after Good Friday of year 33, the curtain is still torn. It was not rewoven. No new curtain was hung. The temple that contained it was destroyed by Roman armies in 70 AD, exactly as Jesus had predicted, without one stone left on another. But the access to God's presence that the tearing of the curtain opened did not depend on the building. It depended on the sacrifice, and the sacrifice is eternal. We have walked together through that extraordinary day, from the crowded streets of Jerusalem before dawn to the Sabbath silence when the stone rolled over the tomb, from the praetorium of Pilate to Golgotha, from the Last Supper to the tetelestai. I leave you with a question I ask you not to dismiss quickly. Is there a moment in your life, a specific moment, when the reality of Good Friday hit you in a way that changed something in you? A moment when it stopped being general history and became your specific story? Write it in the comments, not the theologically correct summary. The real moment. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear today that the curtain was torn for them too, that the price was paid for them too, that the way is open for them too, exactly as they are, without needing to be ready first. Good Friday does not wait for us to be ready. It happened while we were still sinners. That is the depth of the love we have been considering. And if today, finishing this, something inside you recognizes that that sacrifice was also for you, then the most simple and complete answer you can give is the same one the repentant thief gave from his cross. Remember me. The one who answered that request on that Good Friday is still answering, and he is still saying the same thing. Today, you will be with me.